Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone across the globe joining us today. This is Jared from Acquia. Today's webinar is launching a personalization pilot with Acquia Lift, from concept to customers in 10 days, with Dave Sawyer from FFW and MJ Johnson from Acquia. Without further ado, I will pass it over to MJ.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jared, and good to be with everyone. I'm just going to do a quick introduction before I invite our guest, Dave Sawyer, to introduce himself. But my name is MJ Johnson, and I'm the Senior Director of Product Marketing here at Acquia. Very excited to be able to speak to all of you today about personalization, and I'm really excited to welcome Dave. I really believe that the approach that FFW takes with regards to personalization is practical and useful, and I hope will be something that everybody experiencing this webinar will be able to take some concrete actions going forward from. So without further ado, let me give Dave a chance to introduce himself and introduce FFW. So Dave.
Thank you, MJ, and good morning, everyone. This is Dave Sawyer speaking. I'm the Director of Analytics at FFW, and I'm happy to be here today. Background is in technology and strategy, and looking forward to talking about how we can bring both of those things together in a data-driven personalization project or initiative. I work for FFW, and if you haven't heard of us, we're a global digital agency. We've got about 375 team members worldwide, including 140 Acquia certified developers, and we provide a range of services across data insights, design, and development to create engaging experiences for our clients. We're also an Acquia preferred partner and have been working with Acquia since 2007.
Awesome. So just to provide a little bit of context about why Acquia is so excited about FFW's approach and Dave's ideas on how to approach personalization, it really does come down to the reorientation of many organizations around customer experience and this idea of the experience economy, first described in a Harvard Business Review article, probably about 20 years ago, actually. But this is really becoming relevant for all different kinds of businesses and not just digital businesses. Customers of Acquia's, like Wendy's, for instance, are using digital transformation as an umbrella to increase personalization and opportunities to refocus their strategies on how they can engage with audiences across channels, both digital and physical, more effectively. And personalization is a huge part of this. But if you go to the next slide, Dave, what we see, and actually Acquia has been conducting reports and surveys over the last couple of years. Our most recent consumer experience trends report, published in the fall of last year, found that about 90% of customers believe that when it comes to delivering a good customer experience, brands are failing to meet their expectations, which is really a pretty damning statistic when you consider how much focus and how much interest and how many individuals and teams across organizations are really focused on personalization, and yet we're still not meeting the bar of customer expectations. So if you go to the next slide, Dave, you'll see there's really two broad categories of teams that we typically are interacting with in service of delivering experiences that can overcome this gap in customer expectation. The first bucket is really oriented around the operations teams, the developers who are responsible for creating and deploying and managing those experiences. Of course, those teams need to be able to scale those experiences, deploy them, make sure that they're secure, that they're reliable and always available. But they also need to be able to build very quickly. And some of what is involved in doing that is increasingly around low-code page building experiences, templating, reusable widgets, and developers, frankly, putting more tools into the hands of designers and site builders so that they can participate in this process of iteration and delivering an experience and experimentation, which you'll hear Dave talk quite a bit about as we turn to the main part of this presentation. On the other side of that, servicing those experiences with content that can be made relevant for particular audiences are the content creators and marketers who are focused on personalizing those experiences and engaging customers across all the different channels that businesses are utilizing to comprise the interactions with their audiences. So understanding who those audiences are through profiling and segmentation what you're going to hear a tremendous amount about today around personalization and orchestrating those messages across different channels, in addition to actually, of course, creating, authoring, reviewing, approving, retiring. All of that content is the domain of the content creators, and those are obviously, those teams are working in conjunction with marketers. So that's how we've oriented our solution set. And on the last slide that I'll highlight before we get to our survey of the morning, is really around these two areas. The first one being around a cloud of services designed for the operations teams and developers who are trying to build and design and run these sites and applications at scale and securely. That's referred to as the Drupal cloud in Acquia nomenclature. And then very straightforward and easily understood, the marketing cloud, which is about how we help our marketers and content creators understand their audiences, personalize for those audiences, and engage more effectively with an ever increasing feedback loop. And so that's hopefully an orientation about how we think about our solutions. What I would like to do is invite you to participate in a survey. We would love to know, as we're speaking to you live this morning, who in the audience would care to characterize their current experience with personalization initiatives. Do you think your group, your teams are more aspirational and that you're just getting going and really trying to get your feet wet with personalization and getting personalization programs up and running? Maybe you've been thinking about it some time, but now is the time for action. Perhaps you're experienced with it and that you've had some programs that are up and running, and ideally you've taken that that opportunity to capture feedback and to see some results and to begin assessing how those can be used more effectively to engage with audiences. And maybe you're more advanced, in which case you're very familiar with this and you're in the process of utilizing this to feedback all of your personalization programs. So it looks like, and this is pretty exciting because I think a lot of the things you're about to hear from Dave are definitely going to help the aspirational and even the experienced teams that are just getting going with personalization programs or looking to make more with the personalization programs that you've already deployed. So great to see that distribution, 85% aspirational, 15% experience. So Dave, I think that tees you up really well to kind of dig in here and to give everyone some concrete next steps around how they can activate their own personalization programs in their organizations.
Thank you so much, MJ. I really appreciate that. And it's really interesting to see the survey results. And good segue, as you said, into our content today, which is about planning a personalization pilot, which kind of assumes that you might be a little earlier on your own personalization journey and looking to get more into this work and leveraging the strategy of personalization overall. So we'll talk today about how to plan a pilot. We'll provide some example use cases you can use for a pilot. We'll talk for a little bit just about some challenges to watch out for in doing this work. And lastly, we'll close with a day-by-day, 10-day blueprint of exactly what you might want to plan out over the course of a couple weeks if you're doing a simple pilot, and you can adapt that to a larger schedule as needed for your particular use case. Let's jump right in. How to plan a personalization pilot. So the first idea in this entire conversation has to be that we're going to think simple, and we're going to do that by really, really committing to underline the word simple here. Now, it might be common sense for some when beginning a new initiative to keep things simple, but personalization can get very complex very quickly. So we'll ensure the success of our pilot by knowing that at any time if the waters get muddy, we can come back to our simple use case. That'll be our kind of guiding light. And so we'll define that together in a few minutes ahead. And we'll also assume that we're going to start based on some understanding of an existing part of our audience. So we're not going to be talking about learning about the behaviors of people, blank canvas. We're really going to start with something we already know about our customers or our users and use that as the basis for the pilot. And think of this as the very first crawl of a crawl, walk, run approach. So in coming up with our simple use case for our pilot, we might start by doing a little bit of ideation. And we want to understand, what is the use case for personalization for our organization specifically? And this question might be a helpful prompt in doing that ideation. So looking at your site, picking a page that you might call a one-size-fits-all page. And a home page is a great example of this because lots of different representations of your business, your products, different business units all want to be represented on the home page typically. So the prompt becomes, how might a one-size-fits-all page be made more relevant to just one specific audience segment? And as you brainstorm around this idea, I think you start to find ways that you can tailor a page. Let's unpack that a little bit further. As part of the vocabulary for this conversation of building out a personalization pilot, and specifically one that's based on a simple use case, we'll need to break our web pages and parts of the experience on the website into regions within templates that we can start to swap out content and personalize and target content. So for our purposes, we'll refer to those as slots, which we'll define as areas within the website that are used for displaying personalized content, or A/B tests, which we'll get into as well in just a little while here. So as we start to think of our pages as collections of different slots that can be swapped out dynamically with targeted content, then we start to think about what we'll call rules, which will be the conditions and criteria that we use to define which content is displayed to a given user in a given slot for a particular segment. So with this idea then of slots within pages and then rules to control what content shows up in those slots, we have the basic mechanism for changing parts of the experience for one user and not another. And that will be the foundation of the pilot in terms of the functional side of personalization. But coming up with a simple use case and understanding the mechanics of this is not quite enough. We have to adopt an experimentation-like mindset in doing this work. And I fully believe that even if you have a very well mapped out strategy that's based on research and you feel very confident that it's aligned to your customer or to your audience, that the whole process of actually doing this work is a kind of experiment. You're assuming that if you were to target a specific type of content to a certain user at a certain place at a certain time, that would be more relevant or engaging for them. And maybe you're right. But you won't really know if that made a difference until you actually execute on that. So there is an experimental mindset that I think is helpful to doing this work, particularly in a pilot where you're going to have some learnings along the way. So the way to anchor an experimental mindset into this process would be to establish a hypothesis first before you do any work, meaning before you start to configure a tool like Acquia Lift. Have a clearly stated written hypothesis that's the basis for the pilot, that articulates important details like what is the business objective that's driving this pilot? What is the desired outcome or the meaningful outcome to the business that we would expect as a result of changing the experience for some users? And then most importantly, what's our success metric? How do we know if the pilot were successful or not? Ultimately, that's going to boil down to one number going up or down, and we'll talk more about that in a little while. So to build out a hypothesis for a personalization pilot, if you've never done this before, I'll supply these 6 points, which might be seen as the building blocks of the hypothesis itself. So they are, number 1, audience definition. That is, who do you want to reach with personalized content? Number 2, segmentation criteria. Once you've defined your audience, how do we know when an anonymous visitor is hitting our website that they're actually within the target audience we're trying to reach? How do we segment and target them? Number 3, content variation. What will be the content that will be most relevant to just that segment? Location and experience, number 4. Where in the website, which slots, which pages will we focus our targeting? Number 5, expected result. If we do 1 through 4, what will the outcome be? Would we expect more clicks, more form fills, more downloads? What are we expecting users to do once they engage with our targeted content? And number 6, as we said before, success metric. How do we know if it worked? What's the number or numbers that we're watching as part of this process? So a lot of the work in defining the basis for a personalization campaign, and certainly a pilot, is in teasing out these 6 points and making sure they're defined well enough to be able to move forward and execute. So taking these 6 points into account, we can start to group them together to give some framing to a hypothesis. And you might try using the so-called given, when, then framework as a way to do that. And you can see if we take the first 2 and we assign them to given, the second 2 to when, and the third 2 to then, we start to have something that we can articulate more almost in some plain English. And as we tease this out further, we think of the givens as these are the conditions that need to be true. The whens as these are the moments where we're going to target and tailor the experience. And the thens, these are the actions that we're measuring in our analytics and otherwise to determine engagement and conversion. As we flesh that out even further into more of a plain English statement, we start to give shape to our working hypothesis, which is based on a template like you see on the screen now. It might sound something like this. Given that we have a defined audience segment called, I have a placeholder here, my target audience, which describes users that, and that's where we define our segment criteria. And given that we can leverage Acquia Lift to detect in real time when visitors match our segment criteria, when we appeal to the interests of users in our target audience by showing them our targeted content instead of the default content in a specific slot on a specific page, then we would expect our result that we'll define as evidenced by a metric that we define. So now that we have a kind of template to thinking about what the hypothesis is, our next step is to start to take these placeholder variables here and to swap them out with what's meaningful for your website, your organization, and your audience. In fact, as I was building this template out, I was thinking to myself back to growing up and doing Mad Libs. And those of you on the call might remember Mad Libs, where someone asks you some questions for verbs and adjectives and things like that and fills them in, and you end up with a funny story. So I thought, just taking inspiration from that idea, that we might try something real quick here with Acquia. And I want to thank MJ for being willing to do this with me. So MJ, if it's okay with you, I'd love to just ask you some questions right now that we can try plugging in to this template, and you could answer representing Acquia.
I'd love to do it. I don't know how funny the story will be, but it's one that's important to me, so let's do it.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So let's just start by understanding your audience. So if you were trying to think of all of the different audiences that the Acquia website serves, what's an example of one audience that you might want to target through a personalized campaign?
Sure. I sort of alluded to it at the beginning, talking about how developers increasingly need to enable site builders and designers to be able to do more to build sites. So particularly with our Cohesion product, designers are an increasingly important segment for us to be able to get the word out about how we can help them realize efficiency.
Great. So we have now a good example of a broad definition of an audience. And what we want to do is to start to understand, given that that's the audience we want to target, what are the specific online behaviors of that audience? So for example, are there certain types of content on your site that designers might prefer, or certain types of products that Acquia offers that would appeal more to designers? What might be the online behaviors or other detectable criteria that would allow us to assume that a website visitor is a designer as opposed to not?
Sure. And right now we're actually just in the process of trying to get designers to realize that there are products that we offer that can help them. So frequently that could be based on search terms that we can determine relevancy in terms of audience. Certain types of content that we have indicate an interest in design responsibilities on our website, designing content-rich experiences. So there is content related to design responsibilities, and I would say search referrals to our website would also be useful in identifying those members of that audience.
Perfect. Great. So now we've kind of understand the audience you're targeting, how you might detect them on the website through segmentation. Now the question becomes, if you can detect them, what would be an example of a content asset or variation, something that would be targeted to appeal only to just those types of users, and thinking now of their pain points or their primary interests?
Sure. We do have a fairly robust set of resources which offer content design hints and tricks, tutorials for content creators and for designers to support the creation of well-designed sites with users in mind. And really any materials that we have regarding content authoring potentially is an intersection of content that will be of interest to designers.
Awesome. And so something that I'm hearing in there too is that we have the opportunity to leverage personalization strategy in a tool like Acquia Lift here in a couple ways based on what you just said. One would be content recommendations, that you may have a variety of tutorials, tips, tricks, and other content assets that you could display in a list of recommendations to a visitor. And I think another use case is picking one really highly targeted message and then just swapping out some headlines, some imagery, and just going focused on that one piece of content or one single asset that you might put up in a prominent way. So both might be ways of taking the content assets you have featuring them in that way for designers. So that's awesome. So let's kind of just take this to the last step here. Now that we've understood, where we're focusing with users and content, where might be a location in the Acquia.com site that you would expect designers to be browsing, or an area where we could expect our content to be surfaced to designers?
Sure. Some of our Drupal pages are among the more trafficked pages. We get a lot of interest there. Pretty broad audience. Being able to selectively present content, on that Drupal page based on an understanding of where their interest lies, particularly around designers, would be a great place to do that. The homepage is also pretty broadly trafficked by a lot of different audiences. If they do make their way to the cohesion page, that's kind of the pay dirt page. That's really where we would love to be able to present content to show them that, yeah, you really have found the right place for designers to be able to maximize their ability to participate in the design process.
That's great. So we now have identified specific pages. And at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about how we have to adopt an experimental mindset, because as we would move forward with defining this type of segmentation criteria based on, for example, the content assets that a visitor has browsed or the pages they've browsed, we might need 1 or 2 or 3 iterations with our segmentation criteria to refine it and get it just right. So you've got the basis for it there, and we would kind of fine tune our targeting, so to speak. Great. So now we've got the location and the experience, and we define the slots in the pages, and finally we get into the outcomes and the measurement. So if you were able to swap out content on a specific page, surface your targeted content to those designers, what would be an ideal or expected result if that content was really engaging with them and they took a next action?
Next immediate action is engagement with that content, and I would use that to calibrate which content is most relevant, of greatest interest to that selected audience. But really, ultimately, we're trying to put this into the hands of designers to try it out. So we do have a sandbox offer available, which we would love to use as a result of exposing designers to the offer.
Awesome. And that answers actually the last question, which is the success metric, which I would argue you might frame, based on what you've told me, a primary and a secondary metric. So we might be looking for an overall conversion metric of users who sign up for a sandbox or trial, who are exposed to our personalization experiment. But you also might have a secondary success metric of page views or content engagement with the content that you surfaced just to your segment. So thank you for doing this with me, MJ. I think the point of this exercise is to start to see that once you have a kind of framework and a template for realizing what are the questions, what are you trying to identify, it starts to become easier to fill in the blanks, and your working hypothesis will begin to take shape.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. So as we've fleshed out a kind of the basis for a hypothesis for our pilot, we have to start knowing what the various kind of options are for how we can detect the differences between all of the website visitors that we have. And with this work, oftentimes that has to do with understanding segmentation. When using Acquia Lift, for example, you are defining segments based on different combinations of criteria. And this slide shows an example of a range of different segmentation criteria that can be leveraged out of the box with Acquia Lift. And you'll notice that there's nothing on this list that is inherently falling into the category of PII, or personally identifiable information. So that's by design. We want our pilot to not get complicated with use of customer data that might be questionable. We are working in a post-GDPR era today, so the idea is to start simple with data that's readily available that can be used to contextualize the experience. And there's quite a lot we can determine about website visitors before we start getting into any kind of PII conversation. So things like, where are they? What country are they in? What type of browser or device are they using? Custom events, the things that you're already tracking in your analytics, like website downloads and form fills, campaigns, content that they viewed on the site, and other attributes of the browsing session. So we can start to combine these all in different ways into a kind of formula for determining what audience group or another. And that's the basis for segmentation with Acquia Lift. So let's talk about some example use cases. We've got our hypothesis starting to map out, and now the question is, what will be the way that we apply personalization strategy in our particular case for our particular website? So here's 3 examples that might fit your organization. Number 1, campaign parameters. So this is for organizations who, while personalization may be new, you might already be doing other forms of campaigns, for example, like email marketing. And with email marketing and sending people into landing pages, most commonly we use URL parameters in the form of UTM codes to enable us to attribute those visits back to a specific campaign. But in most cases, once the user clicks over to the landing page from the email marketing campaign and that visit is attributed, and then they click to engage further with the brand by browsing around the rest of the website, oftentimes that context of where they came from is kind of lost, and the site kind of switches back to a one-size-fits-all experience. So the basis of use case one is, let's leverage the campaign parameters that you're already using and save those into the profile of the user in Acquia Lift so that we can have that information about what we at FFW called their arrival mindset, and we can persist that into their profile. When someone comes into the site through a campaign, we know the campaign that they came in through, so we know what the messaging of that campaign is. So we have some idea as to what their expectations are in clicking through to the website experience. And the idea is to then use that as an indicator of intent, not just for the landing page where they land, but for the rest of their browsing session and subsequent browsing sessions when they return to the site. Let's take a look at an example of how this takes shape with a real email campaign. So here's an email from Panasonic, great company. They do some email marketing. Here's an example of one of their emails where we see some featured content up at the top. People can click through, but also there's something down at the bottom that I'll call out, which is a bit of self-selection. So the links at the bottom that you see there aren't timely. They don't refer to any specific content asset. They allow the visitor to choose a link that allows them to self-select and self-identify a little bit of like what area of interest they may have within the offerings of the brand. And so this type of input is hugely valuable for personalization, because all of a sudden we can start to filter out the noise of everything and contextualize just down to the area of content that they told us that they're interested in. So clicks like this, even if they happen in an email, are great for starting to cause users to fall into segments for our personalization. So putting that all together, you might have a campaign called the Personalized Site Content campaign, and the objective might be to increase engagement with site content related to featured products that you put into email marketing. So your audience segment might be limited to just users who click links in those emails, which have a certain UTM parameter. And because of that, you're going to choose a specific page, like the home page, and a specific slot within that page, and you're going to specify that. And then you'll identify what's the default content in that slot, and then what's the targeted content that will swap out. In this case, the content swapped out would be consistent with the messaging in the email. And then your success metric might be the click-through rate on the content in that slot on the home page. So the hypothesis here is that more people from the email would click on the targeted content variation than they would on the default content that was already there for everybody else. And using a tool like Lift, you can not only execute on that and deliver the targeted content, but you'll have all the measurement in place to be able to determine if that was effective and if that was the case. Let's take a look at another use case now. Form submissions. Most websites have some type of form, and oftentimes with business-focused sites, those forms have inputs where a user is really telling you quite a lot about themselves. And oftentimes those inputs go into a marketing automation platform or a CRM or some other database storing customer data that is disconnected from the website experience. So even though a user just filled out a form and told you something meaningful about who they are or what they want, as they continue to browse the site doesn't respond to those inputs. It just goes back to that one-size-fits-all experience. So this is a great opportunity for a personalization pilot because it builds off of form inputs that you already have on your site anyway, and just says that we're going to use those inputs as the basis for segmentation. Let's take a look at an example of this. Here's a form that's typical of maybe a B2B type site where the user is clicking to contact the brand and is filling out several select list values on the form. And you can see that the nature of these fields tell us quite a bit about who this customer or potential customer is compared to another. Their product of interest or category of interest, the type of inquiry they're making, the industry they're in, all of these are excellent sources for segmentation criteria that allow us to say, oh, well, You've chosen in this screenshot example, sports, entertainment, and media. So because of that, let's start to contextualize our homepage and other key landing pages, putting more of an emphasis on that industry than another. So how that comes together might look like this. You might have a campaign called personalized site content based on self-selection of industry. The goal is to increase engagement with website content during visitor sessions following a form fill. And the audience segment you would target is users who specifically fill out a form response, as that is the basis of the explicit input for segmentation. And again, you define your location and the experience, the content that you're going to show just for them, and your success metric. I'll show one more use case before we move on to the next section of the presentation today, which is number 3, on-site search. Most sites today have an on-site search feature, particularly business-focused sites, and this is another case where the user is explicitly telling you what they're interested in a way that you can often really find meaning in. So a way to build this out in terms of a personalization pilot might be to start by looking at your web analytics, understanding what are the most searched phrases on the site, and to start to align those search phrases to segments so that when people search for certain phrases or various phrases, they fall into specific segments that are aligned to the needs of people who are performing those search. This is an area where a little bit of analysis in your analytics can go a long way to informing the personalization strategy. Let's take a look at how this one would come together. We would define our campaign where the objective might be to increase engagement with featured products by surfacing products that are more likely to be relevant to a shopper, maybe if this is an e-commerce use case, based on their use of on-site search. So more specifically, let's say someone types into a search on a retailer's site the word kids or children. Right away, we know that we might want to be recommending products that are tagged or have taxonomy associated with kids or children. And just that search event that they initiated causes them to fall into a segment, which causes all those personalizations to kick in. And then further defining our location where, which content we would show, and what's our success metric, in this case, a click-through on the personalized content. So those are 3 examples that are inherently simple because they're all tied to activities or features that you probably already have in place. And the theme here is extending those into segmentation and personalization. So now let's talk about where this gets tricky. If you've been following the topic of personalization today, you've probably seen that it's been one of the hotter topics in digital marketing for years. And a lot of the headlines lead to this word challenges. It turns out that this strategy of data-driven personalization is kind of tricky to execute on. Simple to say, hard to do. So the question is why, and what can we learn from where other organizations have struggled so that we can overcome those challenges? I believe that one of the primary reasons why this gets complicated for folks is because personalization has become a very technical conversation today. Once you start talking about using customer data to change the experience, then you say, well, I have to get into customer data and CDP and customer data platforms and marketing automation platforms. And I have to start getting into data strategy and ETL and ITP, and oh my God, there's acronyms everywhere, and it's overwhelming. And this makes a lot of sense that MarTech today is extremely technical more than ever. But I think this can also be a kind of trap because you can get caught up in trying to solve master data management problems and complex customer data problems when you could be focusing on a very simple use case for personalization on your website as a first step to start to take that first crawl of that crawl, walk, run journey rather than going from 0 to sprinting. And so we see that surveys across our industry reflect this again and again. What are the most effective online tactics versus the most difficult online tactics to execute in a digital marketing strategy for companies worldwide? This particular survey found that data-driven personalization was 63% of respondents indicated that data-driven personalization tactics were the most difficult to execute. So we as an agency in the space see that this can be tricky for a lot of organizations, and we also see lots of surveys like this one example that indicate the same. So our way of kind of talking to this is to really make sure that we start with a really simple use case. and build as our level of personalization readiness and personalization maturity improves. So if we group together all the different challenges that we've seen on sort of our side of things, they might fall into these 6 buckets. User. Having a lack of empathic understanding of the users you're targeting is probably going to lead to a less than successful pilot, right? Because ultimately what we're talking about is appealing to the pain points and interests and needs of specific people. So we have to make sure that we have empathy for them and we understand them so we can appeal to them. That's first and foremost. Second, content. Having a poorly defined content strategy or content governance plan, or just not being able to write good quality content that would appeal to those users also would cause all of this technical stuff to fall down if the content itself just doesn't resonate. The third, data. Having insufficient behavioral data, not having your web analytics up and running and functional, not having customer data to inform the strategy of personalization, just not having enough information to make informed decisions. Fourth, tech stack. This is a conversation where we're combining different technologies from front end to back end, and anytime we're doing that, we often can run into technical issues. So this is another area where organizations can get tripped up. Staffing, people power, just having the resources to deliver and execute, not having access to a multidisciplinary team from content to code. And lastly, experimentation. As we've said, there's an experimental nature to this work. So if you have resistance in your organization to the idea that, hey, not all the pages are going to look the same for everybody. For one audience, they're going to see something different. You may have to be the advocate for that type of change in your organization, of more dynamic, personalized experiences. So these are something to think about as you formulate your strategy. Okay, pulling that together, I think one of the most important points that we can convey to you from our perspective at FFW, which is that successful collaboration in personalization is needed across different business areas. This is a multidisciplinary activity. When we're changing the experience for some users, we're needing to consider user experience design. When we're writing content and serving up different types of content assets, we need to consider content strategy. When we're building our platform to be able to support this type of capability, we've got our tech stack and our development. When we're using customer data and storing customer data and complying with policies like GDPR and CCPA, then we're dealing with customer data and privacy. And of course, we're talking about measuring all of this activity that we're going to be watching as part of our campaign. So we need analytics and the ability to conduct experiments. So usually the skill sets reflected in all of these areas just tend to come from different people. So more than anything, we think it's important to work with a multidisciplinary team, whether you have that team in-house or whether you leverage an agency to pull that together. I think that's really, really important. Okay, we'll close the webinar today by just going over a 10-day plan that brings all of this together. And this might be seen as a way that you can start to create a work breakdown structure or project plan to see how you would actually execute on all of this. Now, a quick disclaimer here, there are some prerequisites. We're assuming that by the time you're doing this, that number one, you already have your team at the ready, that they're going to be available during the timeline of this effort to support the effort in their area. Making sure you have content, technology, analytics, all those areas covered. Number two, we're also assuming that you already have your website platform set up and ready to be used. So that we're assuming that you have a website, probably a Drupal 8 website, and you already have your personalization engine, in this case, Acquia Lift, installed and enabled and connected to that Drupal platform. Third, that you've got that to the point working closely with the good folks at Acquia so that it's ready to be used. And so that you can tinker with it, quite frankly. You can log in, try creating segments, try adding content to slots, and feel comfortable that you have a sandbox or a staging environment that you can use to try all that experimentation in your pilot. So we're assuming that by the time you're at this point, you have these things in place and are ready to start beginning the execution on the pilot itself. And here's the day-by-day plan, or what it could look like. Here's one slide that summarizes all 10 days in one view. I'm about to walk through each of these 10 days on the slides that follow. in this context, day can be taken quite literally, because it may be that your personalization pilot is so simple that 2 weeks of time is sufficient to execute on it. But it may be that you use day here as the idea of a unit of work. And so you can think of these also as the steps, not just literally days, that you might put together in your plan. So let's talk through them. Number one, first day, we're going to start with the user. We always start with understanding our audience. So here's where we're going to define our audience group, just like MJ did with me today in our discussion. Who are we trying to reach? Let's make sure we know who they are. That will be the basis for the pilot. We'll want to understand what are their pain points, their interests, their needs. We can do this by gathering any previously conducted research or customer personas if those are available. And we're identifying what is it that these particular users are interested in. The outputs of this process might be some written definition of our audience, links to related insights about that audience, personas, etc. Once we've gathered our audience and documented it and defined it, then we move on to the next step, which is defining our personalization use case. So this is where we say, what's the business objective that's driving this pilot in the first place? Let's make sure that's understood and not lose sight of that. Let's outline the types of data that we're going to need to support this initiative and how this ties into any existing digital channels or digital marketing activities. And we're also considering at the pilot stage, if this is successful, what would be the next step? How might this be rolled out more widely? Because a pilot is probably not going to be a one and done type of initiative. It's the beginning of a longer conversation. So we want to start to anticipate where we're going. Outputs of this is a documentation of the use case and a list of any requirements that are associated with the project. And you come back to that template that I showed at the beginning as a way to start to build out that use case. On day 3, we might focus more on the content side of the house. So what are the specific content types on our site that might be most relevant to our target audience? Which specific content assets? Who will be responsible for creating that content? Or if you're not producing a new asset, if you're just changing some headlines and some photography, who will be responsible for rewriting the headlines or providing the new imagery? And assessing how that content can be repurposed. So sometimes in personalization, we're completely rewriting new content or creating new assets. In other cases, we're just aligning content that we already have to users in real time to make it more relevant. All right, the outputs here might be a content outline, content schedule, roles and responsibilities on the content side in terms of a production schedule of having content ready to go. Day 4, we get into experience design. Of course, by changing the experience, we need to make sure we understand the design implications of doing that and how that changes the experience on the site. So there may be visual design or creative needs that are a part of this. And so this is where we map those out and take a look at how this changes any existing journeys or flows that have been previously mapped out from an experience design perspective. Day 5, we're going to get into segmentation and targeting. Here's where we're going to say, what are the behaviors or content preferences or detectable attributes of the visitors we're trying to target? And we're going to start to define that very specifically so that we can configure them in the tool, in Acquia Lift in this case. And we'll document our final hypothesis based off of that specific criteria. So here's where we're having outputs including the hypothesis itself now starting to be more fully formed, and the segmentation criteria, et cetera. Brings us to day 6, touch point and rules. So this is where we're starting to get where in the digital experience is this personalization occurring, which pages, what are the specific URLs of those pages, which slots within those pages, which are the assets we're going to swap out. So this is where the rubber starts to hit the road, so to speak. We're really changing the experience now in very specific ways on specific pages. The outputs here might be a definition of the rules and slots and having those documented and very clear to the wider team. And now we're getting towards the culmination on day 7. We've got our content, our audience, our location and the experience all mapped out. And now we're focused on, let's ensure we can measure this content and this campaign. So we're making sure the success metric is 100% clear. We're talking with our teams about, even if the metric is defined, how are we going to analyze the results? What reports need to be pulled? What data do we need to be able to tell the story of the before and the after and the differences? in engagement and conversion. And also, we're going to be considering here any privacy or security requirements that are applicable to the use of a personalization platform in your organization. Outputs here might be a measurement plan, success metric definition, any tracking requirements like tagging in a tag management system, for example, and any security requirements. The last couple of days are really about just staging and final adjustments. At this point, we have the basics in place, and now we're going to start to make some tweaks, do some QA testing, maybe fix some bugs, and really just make sure that it's ready to go. So in this case, when we're done here, we'll have the final content staged in the CMS, and we'll have some preview links that we can share to our stakeholders and team members that says, hey, before we launch this campaign, here are some links that you can view that show what the default content experience would be and what the targeted content experience would be. Which brings us to the last day, and which is the launch day, the most fun day of all of this, of course, because we go live. And here's where we start to plan the activities that will take place after the campaign reaches its end date. This assumes that you're running a campaign with a start and end date as opposed to a campaign that runs continuously. So we'll know in advance that by a certain date, we'll need to take down the campaign, sunset, and start to analyze the results, document the findings, and then socialize those findings. We want to spread this information throughout the organization so people can learn from the pilot experience, and hopefully what this has done is allowed you to understand a little bit more about the interests of your customers and what content resonates or doesn't resonate with them. So where do we go next? If you're interested in learning more about this topic and what FFW could do to help you, check out this URL, ffwagency.com/personalization. A number of content assets up there to continue the conversation. And I'll show just a few closing thoughts before I wrap up and hand things back over to MJ. Number one, as we said, keep it simple. I'm going to come back to this every time. We have to make sure that the basis of our pilot is simple enough to explain in non-technical terms to all of our team, to get everybody on the same page, and to not overcomplicate the pilot. We make sure we'll be successful in that way. And number two, be experimental. Be willing to have a go. Try configuring a segmentation criteria one way and see if it works. And if it doesn't, then that was a learning. So plan to iterate over time and experiment to look for what works in your particular case for your particular audience. Number three, have empathy for the customer. Put yourself in their shoes. What do they want? What do they need? What's their pain point? Why are they taking the time out of their day to come to your website? And how can you put content in front of them that's going to really resonate and appeal to them? Because it's that engagement with that content that's going to drive them to take the next step. And personalization is giving you the opportunity to detect what content is right for that user. Brings us to the fourth point, write relevant content. It's key to just have good quality content. Even if you have your tech stack working great and all of your analytics working great, if the content that you're putting in front of users just doesn't engage with them, then the whole thing falls down. And finally, learn and iterate. You may find that the actual outcome of the campaign is quite different than what you assumed in your stated hypothesis. And I look at that as a win, because even though it's not what you expected, you learned something. You either learned that content that you thought would get a lot of clicks didn't, in which case now you can inform your content strategy or how you might position a follow-up campaign, or you may find you didn't reach the users that you thought that you might reach, in which case you come back to change your segmentation criteria. So there's a learning that occurs just by doing this work. And that's why I encourage organizations to not get caught up in some of the technical traps and complexities of the aspiration of true one-to-one marketing, and start really, really simple at the ground level, iterate and learn. And what will happen is that you'll develop your vocabulary for this work, you'll get good at it, and you'll start to learn more than you've ever known about what works for your audience in terms of targeted content. Just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Once again, my name is Dave Sawyer from FFW, and with that, I'll pass things back to Acquia.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dave. And I've also prompted, we've gotten a couple of quick questions here in the last minutes that we have in the hour. And I've also prompted folks, if you haven't taken advantage of the Q&A facility in the webinar, the fact that we are live here, I would encourage you to take advantage of it. Please don't hesitate to ask very specific questions about your particular personalization efforts, which at the beginning of this webinar, was indicated through the survey that many of you are actively beginning right now. So there was one question which was asking about sort of the importance of understanding the audience, and apparently this might be someone in a retail field or related engagement field or transactional field where they're talking about CDPs. For those who don't know, CDPs are customer data platforms. And I guess asking about, well, how do CDPs tie into personalization initiatives? The thing that I want to highlight, and the reason why I really value the perspective that Dave just shared, is it's an entirely practical, approachable, digestible way of getting your hands around a strategy and actually executing that strategy in a very short period of time, which I think is exactly what this whole talk has been about. CDPs, I think, do afford an amazing opportunity to go very, very deep in terms of analysis and understanding, and sort of those, when we think about those Mad Libs exercises, those initial exercises, I think that Dave was pointing to, about really kind of defining segments and understanding your audience. Those are the specific parts of the Mad Libs equation, I think, that are extremely well suited for CDPs. Now, that said, it is a pretty deep rabbit hole that can afford a tremendous amount of value for organizations who are really oriented around customer data in that way. And so I definitely think that for those who are interested in sort of learning more about CDPs, that's worthy of another presentation. And the way that I think of them as augmenting what you just heard Dave discussing is it really goes very, very deep in that first part of understanding audience and segmentation. And Dave, I don't know if there's anything else you want to sort of highlight in your own perspectives on that.
Absolutely. I love the question. And, I didn't focus too much on CDP today because we're talking about something that has its roots more in A/B testing, just swapping out content for one group and another and using that as the foundation, right, for your personalization experience. However, when we're talking about CDP in the context of personalization today, that's really on point, because ultimately what we're striving for is creating a single definition of a customer, a single view of a customer. And the whole aspiration that I think many of you may have today is that if you could leverage in real time all known information about a customer or a website visitor and use that to tailor the experience. So that would be any calls they've made to a call center, any purchases they've made at a POS, any form fills they've made on a website, any email clicks, et cetera. If you could take all of that information about the way they've engaged with your brand digitally and use that to change the experience, that's where things get really powerful. However, to realize that, there's, for many organizations, a need to change some infrastructure, to go through some digital transformation, moving from a traditional CRM-based setup to having a unified database of customers that marketing can control and access, is a big step for organizations. And I want to be clear, I think it's a really smart move. Anytime you're able to centralize and consolidate customer data into a way that allows you to activate that data in real time is going to enable this and other types of powerful strategies. It's just to say that organizations who have never done personalization before might do well to start with something basic like what I've walked through here today, as opposed to plan to start from 0 to go to 60, to fully enabled integrated customer data. So we understand that customer data exists in many different silos, and we aspire to break down those silos and create a single definition of the customer. And I think a CDP is absolutely an awesome way to do that. But if you don't have a CDP and you want to get started with personalization now, then I think you can start to take a tool like Acquia Lift and start learning about what content works for what segment. That's really, I think, where we focus today.
That came through loud and clear to me, that this is a practical approach with, with the tools that you described to begin actually testing and experimenting and frankly, adjusting right now. The other question that came up here, which I think you've done, I think, a very good job of painting maybe with broad brushes, and you've allowed for a lot of latitude, which is, where everyone on this call has an opportunity to insert their own segments, their own requirements, their own transaction. The question here is, well, what measurements of success should I be focused on to start with? And I guess it's a challenging question because it's very likely indicated by the the business and the specific goals of the initiative. But I don't know, are there particular categories of success metrics that maybe are worth highlighting, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it, as you said, it just depends on the nature of your business and your organization, but there's definitely some commonalities. For example, retailers and e-commerce sites have success metrics based much more on the purchase, right? So we're focused more on things like add to cart, cart abandonment, cart purchase completions, and we're using personalization to motivate users to buy something by delivering more relevant messaging, as opposed to a website that has no transactions. There's nothing you can buy, maybe more of a B2B site or a corporate website. Their metrics might be more about brand awareness. So in that case, page views and getting engagement with content might be more of the focus. Maybe we said B2B websites, maybe there's more of a lead generation focus where the metric that matters more to the business is converting users from anonymous to known. So I think it gets down to, independently of a personalization campaign, what are the best possible outcomes from a business perspective and when it comes to users engaging on your site? And then how can we use personalization as a way to just amplify that, to just accelerate that? So we don't really have different success metrics with personalization. We're just using personalization as a strategy to increase engagement and conversion in the same way that we're trying to do that through other tactics.
Yeah, and I completely agree that some of those categories, I mean, the retail ones, anybody who's in retail on this call is going to already be intimately familiar with those requirements. But for those who don't have transaction-based business models, decreased bounce rate, website traffic versus leads, new versus returning visitors, those are all categories that we look at pretty frequently.
We're working with a client who does a lot of hiring in a very, very large company. So for them, the extent to which their website allows them to attract and retain top talent is one of their top metrics. And so we're using a number of strategies to essentially measure things like clicks to the career site or completions of submissions of job resumes and such. So lots of different ways to frame success. Just ultimately depends on the goals of the business.
Awesome. And thank you so much for sharing your insights. I always appreciate the opportunity to put on one of these sessions with you. I think your approach is based in a practical, measured way of putting something out there and then seeing how that performs and then iterating. So really appreciate the practical guidance on that.
Thank you, Dave and MJ. Thank you all again for attending our webinar, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.